In this video, we're going to see how we assign materials to our mesh in Modo, and how the process differs from the way we do it in Max. While we won't go into too much depth on actually constructing materials in Modo, we'll see the basics of how materials work. So here we are in Max, and I've created a sphere primitive and a box primitive, which could represent a crate, a die, or anything else that has something different on each side. By default, Max creates a different material ID for each side of my box primitive, while my sphere primitive only has one material ID assigned to it, which is ID number 2 by default. Max used the material IDs as a tag to determine which polygon has what material. Right now, both objects have this default material applied to them. I've created a few simple standard materials here. I have a blue material that I've named blue, a couple of noisy materials, and a checkerboard material. If I'm assigning one material to one object, that's pretty straightforward. I can just drag my material onto my object, and the entire object will use that material. Now all the polygons on my sphere object are using the material called green noise, and all the polygons on my cube are using the checkerboard material. But what if I want each side of my cube to use a different material? Right now, if I drag a standard material onto a side of my box, every side uses that material. Well, of course, the solution is to just create a multi-sub-object material, which I've already set up here. And if I drag the multi-sub-object material onto my cube, you can see that each face of the cube, which already has a unique material ID, uses a different material. The multi-sub-object material is really just a way of grouping a bunch of materials that are applied to the same object. And if we switch to the slate material editor, you can visually see how our materials flow into the multi-sub-object material. Now, let's switch over to Modo and see how we would replicate this setup. Here in Modo, you can see that I'm in the Render tab. This viewport works well for setting up materials because we have our real-time render window up here, our item list, our shader tree, and our properties, all available at one time. The shader tree is where we'll be setting up the majority of our materials. Modo also has a nodal shading environment, similar to the slate material editor in Max, and we'll take a look at that a little later in this video. You can see that right now we already have a few things active in our shader tree. We have this base material, base shader, final color output, alpha output, and render settings. It's important to note that the shader tree gets evaluated by the renderer from the bottom to the top. Right now I have two separate objects like I did in Max, a sphere and a cube, and you can see that they're separate objects up here in the item list. Let's add a material to our sphere. Now technically the sphere already has a default material applied to it, but we can't interact with it yet as a separate material. And we can see that if we go over here to the Info and Statistics tab and open our polygon statistics, and then go down and open the material statistics. You can see that we have a material called default, and that it's assigned to 288 polygons in our sphere mesh item. And one way to select polygons by their material is to just click on the little plus sign here, and you can see that all the polygons with the default material in our sphere get selected. I'll deselect them for now. Now, even though our sphere and our cube both have a default material on them, we can't work with that material until we explicitly assign it. If we look at the shader tree, where all our materials in our scene appear, we don't see that default material anywhere yet. The only material we have is the base material. The base material is a special material that is at the bottom of our shading tree. It gets evaluated before any other material and affects every surface in our scene. In effect, this base material is the default material for every polygon in the scene. If I go over to the properties of the base material and make some changes, you can see that the cube and the sphere both get affected in the same way. Now let's see how we would normally get a material group on our sphere that we can work with. I'll make sure our sphere is selected, and then I'll hit the M key to bring up our Polygon Set Material dialog. Let's give our sphere material group the name Sphere, and we'll make it green. I'll leave all the other settings at their default. Now all the polygons are tagged with the material group called Sphere. This is the way you'll normally assign a material group to polygons. We can also assign material groups to polygons by going up to the Texture menu and selecting Assign Material Group. Notice that all the polygons of my sphere have this new green material. Let's select just a few polygons from our sphere. I'll make sure I'm in Polygons mode, and just select a few on the front here. Now let's make a new material group for those polygons. Again, I'll press the M key and create a material group called Sphere Chunk and make it blue. Now just those blue polygons are tagged with the material group Sphere Chunk. You can see that we have two materials on the same object, sphere and sphere chunk, and you can see them here in the shader tree. In Modo, we don't have a special multi-sub-object material. We just select all the polygons that we want to have a certain material and assign a new material name. The material name is really the same as our material ID in Max, in that it's how we tag certain polygons with certain materials. If we look in our polygon statistics again, we now see our two materials, and we can select and deselect those polygons by the materials they use if we want to. Now that we have a material assigned and active in the shader tree, we can manipulate the properties of that material. So we can change the diffuse color and other properties of our materials in the Properties tab. Also notice that if I hide one of the materials, that our base material gets used. Let's add a procedural noise generator to our sphere material group. I'll select the base material of our sphere material group, and then I'll go up, and from the Add Layer drop-down, I'll select Enhance Modo Textures, and then, in the Noise category, I'll select a multifractal effect. Notice that it's just affecting our diffuse color right now. If I go to our base material of our group, I can still change properties like the specularity, and so on. I can change what is affected by our multifractal generator by right-clicking on the effect and choosing another channel to be affected, say the specular amount. And now you can see that fractal noise only affecting my specular hotspot. And of course we could go on and on adding other layers of effects, images, and so on until we have our overall material just the way we want it. So knowing what we know now, we can surface our cube like we did in Max. Remember that Max automatically added a different material ID to each side of our cube. Well, Modo doesn't do that, so we'll need to create a material group for each side ourselves. So I'll select the top polygon, press the M key, and make a material group called Cube Top. Then I'll do the same thing for these two sides. Now you can see our materials over here in the shader tree, and we can change them. As we get more and more materials created in our shader tree, we may want to clean it up or simplify it a bit. One way to do that is to go to the View drop-down and switch from Shader Tree View to Material View. And only materials will be visible then. I'll leave the full Shader Tree view selected. Also notice that if I switch to the Material Selection mode, that as I click on polygons, all the polygons that use that material get selected, and the material itself highlights in the shader tree. Okay, let's add a noise generator layer to this side of the cube. And a checkerboard layer to this side of the cube. Finally, let's take a quick look at the Nodal Shading Graph. The Nodal Shading Graph gets constructed in the schematic view, and we can see the tab for that here. If I select it, you can see that it says Drag and Drop Items or Channels into the workspace. I should point out now that the schematic view is in no way dedicated to just building Nodal Shading Graphs. It can be used for building all sorts of networks in Modo. If I select this Add drop-down, you can see all the various items that can be used to build a nodal network, such as deformers, particles, forces, and more. For materials, we're mainly interested in channel modifiers, shader inputs, and shader nodes. In Max, the Nodal Slate Material Editor effectively replaces the Compact Material Editor, but in Modo, the shader tree and the Nodal Shader interface work together. Your materials will always start in the shader tree, and then, if you're building a more complex material, you can use the Nodal Shading Graph to build it in a more visual manner. Some material effects can only be achieved in Modo using this nodal shading approach. So let's build a very simple nodal shading graph. First, let's drag a material into the schematic view. I'll grab the base material of the side of our cube that has the fractal noise on it. The data flow in the schematic view works from left to right, with inputs on the left and outputs on the right. Let's say we want to randomly change the diffuse amount value of our material on every frame of our animation. I'll add the random value node to the schematic. And then, to pipe the output value from the random node to our material, I'll just click and drag from the output to the input of our diffuse amount. With the random value node selected, I can go over and adjust its properties. And now if we scrub through our timeline down here, you can see our diffuse amount change on every frame. If I select our material, notice over here in our material properties that we now have this symbol next to our diffuse amount that denotes that it's being driven by another node. I could easily do an entire tutorial series on constructing materials in the shader tree and the Nodal Shading Graph, but hopefully this brief overview will get you started on exploring material creation in Modo. Next, we're going to see how to transfer a simple object between Max and Modo.